Welcome to Sleepy Harbor. Tonight, you don't have to do anything at all. You've already done the hardest part, which was simply lying down. The light is low, or it's off completely. The day, with all of its noise and its small demands, is finished now, whether or not it feels finished. And you're here in the quiet with me. That's enough. That's the whole of what's needed from you tonight. I want to tell you something before we begin. Something that might already be true in your body right now. There's a very good chance that the moment your head touched the pillow, your mind started up. Not gently, not the way you wanted it to. It started replaying, it started rehearsing, it pulled up a conversation from this afternoon or a worry about tomorrow or some old regret that has no business being awake at this hour. And it set the whole thing spinning. And maybe somewhere underneath the spinning, a quieter and more painful thought arrived too. The thought that says, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just stop? Everyone else is asleep. Why is my brain like this? So let me say the most important thing first before anything else, so you can carry it with you through the whole of tonight. There is nothing wrong with you. The restless mind that comes to you at night is not a broken mind. It is not a weak mind or an anxious mind that other, calmer people have somehow escaped. It is a completely ordinary brain doing a completely ordinary thing at the 1 hour of the day when that ordinary thing happens to be the least convenient. By the time we're finished, I want you to understand the machinery of it so clearly, so gently, that the understanding itself becomes a kind of rest. Because it can. Knowing why a thing happens takes a surprising amount of the fear out of it. And tonight, the science is not here to alarm you. The science is the comfort. You don't need to know anything about the brain to listen. You don't need to remember a single name or a single study. If you drift off in the middle of a sentence, that's not a failure. That's the entire point. I'll keep the thread for you. There's nothing to figure out, nowhere else to be, and nothing you have to achieve before morning. You can let your eyes close whenever they want to. The words will keep going soft and slow, like a lamp left on in another room. Before we go further, if you'd like to, you can leave a small note in the comments. Just tell us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from tonight. Not because you have to, only because it's a quiet, kind thing. Knowing that somewhere out there, another person is lying in their own dark room at their own late hour, listening to the same gentle voice, carrying their own version of the same restless night. You are not the only one awake. You never were. Now, let's take a slow, deep breath together. In, gently, through the nose. Let it fill you without effort. And then a long, slow breath out, longer than the breath in, letting your shoulders drop a little further away from your ears. Wherever you are, however you're lying, let yourself settle in. Let the bed hold your whole weight. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore tonight. The mattress is doing that for you. The pillow is doing that for you. You can let go of just a little of the holding right now, and nothing bad will happen. The room will still be here. You will still be here, just softer. Thank you for being here with me. Let us begin. Here is the first thing to understand, and it's the thing almost nobody tells you, the thing that quietly changes everything once you really take it in. Many people believe that the mind is like a machine with an off switch, that when the work of the day is done, when the tasks are finished and the screens are dark and you finally lie down, the mind should simply power down. Go quiet, settle the way a house settles when everyone in it has gone to bed. And when it doesn't, when instead it roars to life and starts churning, people blame themselves. They think, my mind won't turn off. And the unspoken second half of that sentence is, and that means something is wrong with me. But here is the truth, and it's a strange and beautiful one. Your brain does not have an off switch. It was never built with one. And this isn't a flaw in you, it's the design of every human brain that has ever existed, including the brains of the calmest, most peaceful sleepers you've ever envied. When you lie down in the dark and take away the day's tasks, your brain does not go quiet. It does something far more interesting. It changes channels. Let me explain this gently because it's the foundation of everything tonight. About 25 years ago, a scientist named Marcus Raichle, working at Washington University, was studying brain activity, and he noticed something that puzzled him. He was looking at people's brains while they did tasks, the way you'd watch a city light up at the windows where people are working. And he expected that when he gave someone a task, certain regions of the brain would switch on, would brighten, would get busy, and they did. That part made sense. But he noticed something else, something he hadn't gone looking for. There was a particular set of brain regions that did the opposite. Every time he gave a person a task to focus on, those regions got quieter, they dimmed. And every time the task ended, every time the person was simply left to rest, doing nothing, those same regions lit back up. Think about what that means for a moment. Here was a part of the brain that got busiest precisely when there was nothing to do, a part of the brain that came alive in the quiet. Raichle published this work in 2001, and he gave this set of regions a name that has stuck ever since. He called it the default mode network, the default. The setting your brain returns to when nothing else is asking for its attention. The thing your mind does automatically by default, the moment you let it off the leash of a task. Now, the default mode network isn't one single spot. It's more like a small constellation of regions that talk to each other, scattered across the brain. There's a part near the front, behind your forehead, called the medial prefrontal cortex. There's a part toward the back and middle called the posterior cingulate cortex, and near it, a region called the precuneus. And there's a part along the side, the angular gyrus. You don't need to remember any of those names. Let them wash right past you. The only thing that matters is the picture. A handful of regions spread across your brain that are wired together into a single quiet network. And here is what that network does. Here is its job. The default mode network is the part of you that thinks about you. It's the seat of self-referential thought. It's where you replay your own memories, the things that happened to you, the autobiography you carry around. It's where you imagine your own future, rehearse the conversation you'll have tomorrow, picture how things might go. It's where the mind wanders away from the present moment and drifts into the story of your own life. Scientists who studied this network closely, researchers like Buckner and Andrews Hanna and Schachter, who described it carefully back in 2008, found that this is the system that handles all of it. The past, the future, the self, the inner world. And now you can see the trap, can't you? You can see exactly what happens when you lie down at night. All day long, the world gives your brain things to focus on. There's the road in front of you, the person talking, the work on the screen, the meal to cook, the message to answer, the thousands small external tasks that keep the spotlight of your attention pointed outward, away from yourself. And every time your attention points outward at a task, the default mode network dims. It steps back. It waits in the wings. The outward focus and the inward focus take turns, and during the busy day, the outward focus wins again and again and again because the world keeps handing you something else to look at. Then night comes. You finish the last task. You turn off the last light. You lie down in a dark, quiet room where there is, finally, nothing to do. No road, no screen, no conversation, no meal. Nothing outside of you asking for your attention at all. And the spotlight, with nowhere outward left to point, swings inward. The default mode network, which had been dimmed all day by the steady stream of tasks, comes fully, brightly online. And it does exactly what it's built to do. It turns your attention onto yourself, onto your memories, onto your future, onto the unfinished business of your own life. This is not your mind malfunctioning. This is your mind doing the most natural thing in the world the instant you remove the only thing that was holding it back. The quiet didn't fail to calm you. The quiet is what switched the inward network on. Sit with that for a moment because it's a gentle kind of relief once it lands. When you lie down and your mind starts spinning, you are not failing to sleep. You are watching a perfectly healthy brain do precisely what every healthy brain does when the tasks fall away. The spinning is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that the day is over and the default has returned. You were never supposed to have an off switch. Nobody is. The calm sleeper next door doesn't have one either. They just, for whatever reason on this particular night, had a little less waiting for their inward spotlight to find. And this explains something that has probably frustrated you your whole life. It explains why the advice to just stop thinking never ever works. People say it to you, well-meaning people. Just clear your mind, just stop thinking about it, just relax. And you've tried, haven't you? You've lain there and commanded your mind to go blank, and it only churned harder. Now you know why? Because telling your brain to stop focusing on a task is not a way out of the inward mode, it's the doorway in. The absence of a task is the very condition that switches the wandering self-focused network on. So when you try to empty your mind, you are removing the last task it had, which only deepens the default. You can't think your way out of thinking by trying not to think. The trying is itself a kind of task, and when you drop it, the spotlight swings inward once again. There is no door in that direction. We'll find the real doors later, much later, when you're softer and closer to sleep. For now, you only need to know that the locked door was never your fault. Let me give you a number because it makes all of this feel less lonely. There's a study that has become quite famous, done by two researchers named Killingsworth and Gilbert, and they wanted to know something simple. They wanted to know how much of the time a person's mind is actually here, in the present moment, versus how much of the time it has wandered off somewhere else. So they did something clever. They built a way to reach out to people at random moments throughout their ordinary days and ask them right now, what are you doing? And is your mind on what you're doing, or has it drifted somewhere else? And they gathered all of these moments, thousands and thousands of them, from people living their normal lives. And what they found was this: the human mind wanders for roughly 47% of waking life. 47%. Let that sink in slowly. Nearly half of your waking hours, your mind is not on what's in front of you. It has slipped its leash and gone wandering off into memory, into the future, into the story of yourself. And this is true for everyone. It was true for nearly half of every person's day in that study. This is not a quirk of the anxious or the troubled. This is simply what it is to have a human mind, half awake to the world, half adrift in itself. They titled their work beautifully and a little sadly, "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." It was published in the journal Science in 2010. Now that title points to the harder part of what they found, and I want to handle this part with care because it could sound discouraging, and tonight it is not meant to be. They found that when people's minds had wandered, those people tended to report feeling a little less happy than when their minds were present with what they were doing. And here's the detail that matters most. When they looked closely at the order of things, the wandering tended to come first, and the dip in mood followed. The wandering wasn't just an escape from an already low mood, it seemed to lead the way. The mind drifts off, and then, a little while later, the feeling sinks. I know how that could land at the wrong hour, but hear the gentleness in it. This is not a flaw you carry alone. This is the texture of the human mind itself, in nearly half of all its waking moments, in nearly every person alive. The drift toward the inner world and the small weight that can come with it is simply part of the standard equipment of being a person. So when you lie in the dark and your mind wanders into something that makes your chest tighten, you are not broken and you are not uniquely cursed. You are running the same wandering that runs in every head on this dark side of the planet right now, including all the heads that will, eventually, fall asleep just fine. The wandering doesn't mean the night is lost. It only means you have a human brain, and it's doing the most human thing there is. And now you might be wondering, if this wandering happens all day, nearly half my waking life, then why does it feel so much worse at night? Why is the worry I barely noticed at noon suddenly enormous and roaring at midnight? That's the right question. And the answer is the gentlest part of all, so let's go there slowly. During the day, your wandering mind has competition, constant, relentless competition. There's the conversation you're half in, the task on your desk, the person crossing the street, the kettle starting to whistle, the message lighting up your phone, the thousand small sensations and demands of a world full of things. All of that is pouring into your attention all day long, and every bit of it acts as a buffer, a distraction buffer. The worry is still there, somewhere underneath. It's been there all along. But it can't get the floor because something louder and more immediate keeps grabbing the microphone. The dripping tap of your worry is real, but during the day, it's drowned out by the roar of the river. You barely hear it. Researchers who study mind wandering, people like Smallwood and Schooler, who wrote about the science of it carefully back in 2015, describe this in terms of competing demands. During waking hours, your working memory, the small workspace at the front of your mind where you hold whatever you're dealing with right now, is occupied. It's full. It's busy holding the meeting, the recipe, the directions, the conversation. There simply isn't much room left over for the unresolved emotional weight to surface and spread out. The day keeps your inner workspace crowded, and a crowded workspace has no floor space for rumination to lay itself out. And then, night. You turn off the lights, the tasks end, the conversations end, the screen goes dark, or it should. The world stops pouring its thousand things into your attention. The river of the day quiets down to a trickle, and then to nothing. And in that beautiful, longed-for silence, the silence you've been craving since the alarm went off this morning, the dripping tap that was always there, finally becomes the loudest sound in the room. Not because it got louder, because everything else got quiet. This is the thing I most want you to understand tonight, the thing that turns self-blame into self-forgiveness. The quiet of the night is not a peaceful, empty room where your worries decided to invade. The quiet is the trigger, the very stillness you wanted, the very absence of distraction you longed for all day, is precisely the condition that hands your wandering, self-focused mind the open floor. Your working memory, occupied all day, is suddenly free. And into that free space, the unfinished emotional content of your life rises up, the way silt rises in still water once you stop stirring it. You didn't do anything wrong to make the worries appear. You simply, finally, got quiet. And quiet is where the inner world gets its turn at last. So when you lie there at midnight and a worry blooms up that you swear you weren't even thinking about an hour ago, you can understand it now, kindly, without fear. It was always there. It was just buried under the day. Lying down didn't summon it. Lying down only removed the things that were burying it. The silence you reached for was always going to hand the microphone to your inner voice, because that is the design in every human being of a brain that finally has nothing else to do. There's a freedom in that if you let it settle. It means the loud mind isn't proof that something terrible is true. It isn't even proof that the worry is important. It's just proof that the room got quiet enough for you to finally hear what was always humming underneath. The volume tells you about the silence around the thought, not about the truth or the size of the thought itself. A small worry in a quiet enough room can sound enormous. That doesn't make it enormous. It only makes the room quiet. So let's gather very softly what we've found so far, and then let's pause and breathe, because you've taken in a great deal already, and there's no hurry at all. Your brain has no off switch, and it never did. When the day's tasks fall away, a network inside you called the default mode network comes online, and it turns your attention gently, automatically, onto yourself, your past, your future, the unfinished story of your own life. This happens in everyone. Your mind wanders for nearly half of your waking hours, and that wandering is simply part of being human. And at night, when the world finally stops handing you things to look at, that inward attention has no competition left at all, and the quiet you longed for becomes the very thing that lets your inner voice fill the room. None of it is a flaw in you. All of it is ordinary machinery running exactly as it was built to run at the 1 hour when its running is least convenient. You are not broken. You are human, lying down at the end of a long day with a perfectly normal brain doing a perfectly normal thing. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath in. Let it come in without any effort on your part, just an easy filling. And then let it out, even more slowly, a long, soft exhale that you don't have to push. Notice, if you'd like to, how the bed is holding you. Notice the small weight of your own hands wherever they're resting. Notice the quiet of the room, and let it be friendly now, instead of something to fear, because you understand it a little better than you did a few minutes ago. The quiet is just the quiet. It's switched on the inner voice, yes, but the inner voice is only your own mind keeping you company, the way it keeps every person company at the end of every day. There's nothing you need to fix in this pause, nothing to solve, nothing to remember. If your eyes are already heavy, let them be heavy. If a thought drifts in, you don't have to chase it, and you don't have to fight it. You can just let it float by, the way you'd watch a small boat drift across a still harbor at night going somewhere that has nothing to do with you. You don't have to row after it, you can just watch it go and stay where you are, warm and held and still. And when you're ready, in your own time, with no rush at all, we'll continue together. Because there's more to understand, and the next part is the gentlest part of all. It's the reason the thought that feels so unbearably, undeniably true at 2 a.m. isn't actually truer than it was at noon. It only feels that way for a very particular reason, and once you know the reason, a great deal of the weight comes off. But that's for in a little while. For now, just breathe and rest, and let the harbor hold you. Welcome to Sleepy Harbor. If you've just arrived here tonight, you don't need to know anything at all before we begin. You don't need to have read anything or understood anything, or be the kind of person who falls asleep easily. You can be the opposite of that. You can be the person who has been lying here for an hour with a mind that won't go quiet. You are especially welcome here. Settle in however you're comfortable. Pull the blanket up if you'd like, and if you feel like it, you might leave a small note somewhere below telling us what time it is, where you are, and what corner of the world you're listening from, just so we know who's drifting off alongside you tonight. There are more of us than you'd think, all in our separate dark rooms, all listening to the same gentle voice. Take one slow, deep breath. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in. Let your shoulders drop down away from your ears. There's nowhere else to be. Now here is the thing almost no one tells you, the thing that I think changes everything once you really feel it. The restless mind that starts up the moment your head hits the pillow is not a flaw in you. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong with you, or that you're more anxious than other people, or that you're failing at the simple animal task of falling asleep. That busy, looping, wandering mind is one of the most ordinary things a human brain does. It happens in this bed, and in the bed of the person 3 streets over, and in beds on the far side of the planet where it's bright afternoon. It is not new, and it is not yours alone. It is, in a very real sense, the brain simply being a brain. Let me show you what I mean, because the science here is so much kinder than it sounds. For a long time, people imagined the brain a little like a machine that you could switch off, stop giving it a task, and it would go dark and quiet, the way a room goes dark when you flip the light. So when you lie down at the end of the day with no work to do and no screen to read and no one to talk to, you'd expect the brain to wind down too. You'd expect quiet. But that's not what happens. And the reason it isn't is one of the most curious discoveries in modern neuroscience. Back around the year 2001, a researcher named Marcus Raichle at Washington University noticed something strange. He was watching what brains did when people were given things to do, and he kept seeing certain regions that didn't light up during the tasks. They did the opposite. They went quiet whenever a person concentrated on something out in the world, and then, the moment the task ended, they switched back on. They were busiest precisely when there was nothing to do. He called this collection of regions the default mode network, the default, the setting the brain returns to when you let it rest. And it isn't a small thing tucked away in a corner. It's a whole connected web running through the middle of the brain behind your forehead, a region called the medial prefrontal cortex, and back toward the center and the rear, places with names like the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, the angular gyrus. You don't need to hold any of those names. You can let them go the instant you hear them. The only thing worth keeping is the picture. There is a part of you that wakes up the moment the outside world goes still. And what does it do, this default network? A few years later, researchers named Buckner, Andrews, Hanna, and Schachter mapped it out carefully. And what they found is almost touching when you think about it. This network is the home of your sense of yourself. It's where you remember your own life. It's where you imagine your future, where you turn things over, where you wonder about the people you love and the things you've said and the things you still have to do. It is the part of the brain that thinks about you. So picture what happens when you lie down. All day long, the world has been pulling your attention outward, onto roads and faces and screens and small urgent tasks. Then the room goes dark. The tasks fall away. There is nothing left out there to hold you. And so the brain does exactly what it's built to do. It turns inward. The default network rises, and your attention, with no outside place to land, comes home to rest on the one subject that's always available: yourself, your day, your worries, your past, your future, the whole quiet weight of being a person. There is no off switch. There never was. When you remove the task, the brain doesn't go silent. It simply turns its lamp around, away from the world, and shines it back on you. That is why telling yourself to just stop thinking has never once worked. The absence of something to think about is the very thing that invites the thinking in. And it turns out this inward wandering isn't a rare event reserved for sleepless nights. It's a huge part of being awake at all. Some years ago, 2 researchers, Killingsworth and Gilbert, did something clever. They gathered thousands of ordinary moments from ordinary people's days and simply asked them again and again, what are you thinking about right now? Are you focused on what you're doing, or has your mind drifted somewhere else? And what they found was that for nearly half of our waking lives, about 47% of the time, our minds are not on the task in front of us at all. They're wandering somewhere else entirely. Almost half your waking life, the mind is roaming. So the wandering you feel at night is not some new affliction that descends on you at bedtime. It's the steady background hum of human consciousness. It's only that during the day you barely notice it because there's so much else going on. The study found one more thing, and I'll say it gently because it sounds heavier than it needs to. A wandering mind tended to come just before a dip in mood, not a crash, not a catastrophe, just a small, quiet lowering. They named the paper simply, "A wandering mind is an unhappy mind." But notice what that really means for you, here, tonight. It means the heaviness you sometimes feel as the thoughts begin to loop is not a sign that your life is worse than other people's. It's a side effect of a mind doing the most natural thing there is, in the one place where there's nothing left to distract it from itself. And that word, distract, is the whole secret of why the night is harder than the day. Because during daylight, the wandering is buffered. Researchers like Smallwood and Schooler, who've spent years studying exactly this drifting of the mind, describe it well. All day, a constant stream of things crowds in, people to answer, lights and sounds and small decisions. Your working memory is full, occupied, busy. And all that busyness acts like a kind of gentle wall between you and the looping, self-focused thoughts. The same worry that would feel enormous at midnight gets drowned out at noon, simply because there's 100 other things competing for the space. Then night comes, and one by one the world takes those things away. The lights go out, the phone goes down, the voices stop, and the wall comes down with them. The worry that was there all along, just held at bay, suddenly has the whole quiet room to itself. It becomes the loudest thing in the house, not because it grew, but because everything that was covering it has fallen silent. So when you feel a thought rise up in the dark and seem to fill the entire room, this is what's happening. The quiet didn't create the thought. The quiet just stopped hiding it. The trigger isn't some failing in you. The trigger is the silence itself, doing exactly what silence does. Let us pause here for a moment and rest with that, because it's a good place to rest. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice, if you can, the way the body has already begun to settle. You don't need to do anything with what you've heard so far. You don't need to hold it or file it anywhere. Just let it sit beside you, the way you'd let a warm lamp sit on a bedside table. It doesn't demand anything, it's just there. When you're ready, we'll continue. There is a word that researchers use when they talk about what the mind does in those dark, quiet hours. The word is rumination. It comes originally from the Latin for chewing. The way a cow chews its cud, bringing the same mouthful back up again and again, grinding it slowly without really consuming it. That image is not accidental. The people who study this, and the psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksema was among the most important of them, the one who gave the field its clearest language, chose that word deliberately because it captures something true about the texture of the experience. You are not solving, you are not learning, you are not moving forward through the material, you are chewing the same bite again and again. Nolan Hoeksema spent decades studying why people get stuck in their own minds, and her framework, which she called response styles theory, draws a careful distinction that's worth pausing on, because when we say overthinking, we often lump two quite different things together, and they're actually not the same, even though they feel similar in the dark. One of them is worry. Worry is future-facing. It asks, what if? What if this goes wrong? What if I'm not enough for what's coming? What if tomorrow brings what I'm afraid tomorrow might bring? It's the mind scanning the horizon for threats, pacing the watchtower, even when no enemy is visible. The other is rumination. Rumination looks backward. It asks why. Why did I say that? Why did it go that way? Why didn't I handle it differently? It is the mind returning to a closed door and trying the handle again, as though this time, with enough effort, the door might open and give a different answer. Edward Watkins, who has written carefully about what he calls repetitive negative thinking, puts both worry and rumination under the same umbrella. They are both forms of looping, of circling the same ground without resolution, but they circle in different directions. Worry turns toward tomorrow. Rumination turns toward yesterday, and in the quiet of the night you may find yourself doing both, sometimes within the same minute, replaying what happened this afternoon, and then without noticing the shift, suddenly anxious about what might happen tomorrow because of it. The loop swings between the two, past and future, like a pendulum suspended in the dark. The present moment, the actual room, the actual bed, the actual warmth under your hands. That gets harder to find. This matters not because you need to diagnose yourself, but because understanding what the mind is doing helps you be less afraid of it. It isn't broken. It is doing one of the things minds were shaped to do: reviewing, anticipating, looking for unresolved things and nudging you toward them. The problem is not the design. The problem is the timing and the room and the silence. We'll come back to that. But first, let's follow the loop a little further, because there's something happening in the night that makes these thoughts darker than they deserve to be. Here is something that researchers have known for a while, and that feels almost too simple when you say it plainly, but the implications of it are quite remarkable. When it comes to how experience lands in the human mind, bad is stronger than good. Not somewhat stronger, meaningfully, measurably stronger. Roy Baumeister and his colleagues published a paper with almost exactly that title, Bad is Stronger Than Good, in 2001 in the Review of General Psychology, and it pulled together a wide range of findings from different areas of psychology and arrived at a conclusion that is uncomfortable but hard to dispute. Negative events leave a deeper mark than positive ones of similar intensity. Criticism is felt more than praise when the two are roughly equal in size. Losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good. A bad interaction with a stranger lingers longer than a kind one. The psychologists Paul Rossi and Edward Roisman, working separately on what they called negativity bias and negativity dominance, found similar patterns. The mind doesn't weigh positive and negative equally. It tilts reliably and significantly toward the negative. This is not a flaw in you. It is an almost certainly ancient feature of nervous systems that learned over a very long period that the cost of missing a threat is higher than the cost of missing an opportunity. Missing the berry is unfortunate. Missing the predator is fatal. So the brain evolved to be a better threat detector than a pleasure accumulator. The scales were never meant to be even. But here is what matters for your night. That bias, that tilt toward the dark, runs on top of whatever other state the brain is in. And in the late hours, the brain is in a state that turns the volume up on every negative thought and turns the volume down on everything that would normally argue back. Let me explain what that means. There is a part of your brain called the amygdala. It sits deep inside the temporal lobe, one on each side, and it is the brain's alarm system. Its job is to detect threat quickly, to flag emotional significance, particularly danger, and to trigger a response before the slower, more reasoned parts of the brain have time to catch up. Joseph Ledoux, the neuroscientist who spent much of his career mapping this system, described what he called the low road of emotional processing. The low road runs directly from the senses to the amygdala, bypassing the cortex almost entirely. It is fast. It doesn't wait for evidence to be assessed. It reacts before you think. And it is tuned with great sensitivity to things that could be wrong. The amygdala is why you flinch before you know you're flinching. Why the shadow in the hallway at night makes your heart knock before your eyes have finished processing the shape. It's fast, it's loud, and it tends to interpret ambiguity as danger rather than waiting around to find out. Now, against the amygdala, the brain normally posts a kind of counterweight. The prefrontal cortex, that slower, more deliberate part of the brain that sits just behind your forehead is very much involved in regulating what the amygdala does, not silencing it entirely, but modulating it. The way a hand can rest gently on a drum and soften the sound without stopping it. The prefrontal cortex provides context. It considers evidence. It says, yes, this feels alarming, but let's think about whether it actually is. It applies something like perspective. And here is the piece that changes everything about what happens in the night. Matthew Walker, a sleep researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, and his colleagues, including a study published by Gujar, Joles, and Walker in Current Biology in 2007, found that sleep deprivation doesn't affect the brain evenly. It hits the prefrontal cortex hard. It weakens the regulatory link between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The brakes soften. And when the brakes soften, the amygdala runs louder and with less interference. In their research, sleep-deprived participants showed dramatically increased amygdala responses to emotionally negative images, sometimes on the order of 60% more reactive than well-slept controls. 60%. And at the same time, the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the circuit that would ordinarily provide that moderating hand, was functionally weakened. The alarm runs hot. The regulatory hand has grown lighter. Now think about what that means for your 2 a.m. mind. You are tired, genuinely tired, because you've been awake all day, because adenosine has been accumulating in your brain since the moment you woke up, building what researchers call sleep pressure, the chemical signal of fatigue. You are not imagining the tiredness. It is real, physical, measurable, and yet here you are, awake. And every thought that surfaces in that state surfaces into a brain where the alarm is running louder and the volume dial on negative emotion has been turned up, while the part of the brain that would ordinarily argue back and say, wait, let's think about this more carefully, is running quieter and slower than normal. The thought that feels so completely, viscerally true at 2 in the morning is not truer. It is simply louder. It is the alarm with weakened brakes. The amygdala reading ambiguity as threat, the negativity bias doing what it evolved to do, and no sufficiently rested prefrontal cortex available to gently say, hold on. The problem hasn't grown. The brain's equipment for evaluating the problem has temporarily changed. That thought that feels undeniable, the one about the mistake you made or the relationship that worries you, or the thing you should have done differently, it will not feel the same in the morning. Not because the morning is full of easy answers or because daylight makes hard things disappear, but because the brain that appraises it in the morning will have had sleep. An arrested prefrontal cortex restored to its usual connection with the amygdala genuinely sees the same situation differently, not with denial, with proportion. You are not being melodramatic at midnight, you are being accurate about how the midnight brain experiences things, and you are not broken. You are tired, with a nervous system doing exactly what tired nervous systems do. There is a loop here, and it's worth naming because once you see it, you can be less caught by it. Andrew Goldstein and Matthew Walker described it in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology in 2014. Worry and the elevated arousal that comes with it costs you sleep. It delays the onset of sleep. It fragments what sleep you get, and the sleep you lose in turn makes the amygdala more reactive and weakens the prefrontal regulation you'd need to quiet the next wave of worry. So the worry worsens the sleep and the poor sleep worsens the worry. The loop feeds itself. It is not a loop you created. It is not evidence that you are especially anxious or especially prone to struggle. It is a very human system closing around itself in the dark, doing what systems do when their inputs reinforce each other. The first step out of it is simply understanding it, because understanding changes the relationship. The worry becomes less frightening when you can see it. It becomes something happening to a particular kind of brain at a particular hour, rather than the voice of truth speaking in the dark. So take a breath now. Just one slow breath. Notice the weight of where you're resting, the place your head meets the pillow, the place your hands rest wherever they are. You don't have to do anything about the thoughts that have come up tonight. You don't have to resolve them. You don't have to figure out what's true and what isn't. You don't have to be certain about anything before morning. The thought that visits you in the dark is not more true because it visits at night. It is just less argued with. And you are lying in the dark with a mind that is doing something very ordinary, very human, and very temporary. It will look different in the morning. That is not a platitude. That is something quite specific happening in the brain while you sleep. And we will get to it gently. But for now, just notice the breath, notice the quiet. Notice that even in the middle of all that circling thought, there is a background hush. The room around you, whatever room it is still. The noise is mostly inside, and inside is where understanding can travel to. Let's pause here together for just a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. In through the nose if that's comfortable, and then out, a little longer than the breath in. Let the out-breath go all the way to the end. Notice what happens in the chest and the belly when you do that. The way something just slightly releases. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to figure anything out tonight. When you're ready, we'll continue. Let's follow the loop a little further because there's one more piece of this nighttime machinery that deserves a close look. It sits at the center of why those thoughts won't simply stop, even when part of you knows you should sleep, even when you are genuinely exhausted, even when you've been lying still for a long time and would give almost anything for the mind to just go quiet. You have two systems pulling in different directions, and understanding them makes the experience feel less like personal failure and more like physics. The first is what researchers call sleep pressure. Throughout every hour that you've been awake today, right from the moment you opened your eyes this morning, a chemical called adenosine has been accumulating in your brain. Adenosine is a kind of biological accountant. It keeps a running record of how long you've been awake, and as it builds, it produces the feeling of mounting tiredness, the heaviness behind the eyes, the way the head wants to dip, the sluggishness that settles into the limbs by evening. This is not fatigue as a mood, it is fatigue as chemistry, as a physical state of the brain, as pressure building towards sleep, the way water pressure builds behind a dam. The Swiss sleep researcher Alexander Borbély described this elegantly in what became known as the two-process model of sleep regulation, a framework he first outlined in 1982 and that researchers have continued to refine since, including an updated account published in the Journal of Sleep Research in 2016. In this model, two processes run in parallel, always like two hands of a clock. Process S is the sleep pressure, adenosine accumulating, the biological drive to sleep, growing across the waking day. Process C is the circadian alerting signal, the rhythm of the body's internal clock, which at certain times of day sends a push toward wakefulness to counteract the growing sleep pressure. The elegant thing about this system is that ordinarily the two processes are coordinated. By evening, sleep pressure is high and the circadian alerting signal begins to ease off and you feel genuinely ready for sleep. The pressure wins. You drift off. And while you sleep, adenosine is cleared. So by morning, sleep pressure is low and the circadian clock begins its new alerting push and you wake refreshed. The two processes have danced together through the night and reset themselves. But sometimes when there is stress, when the mind is running loops, when rumination is elevating the nervous system, something else enters the balance. A second signal that pulls against the natural descent into sleep. This is where the tiredness and the wideness come together in a state that many people recognize, but that doesn't always have a clean name. Tired, but wired. The body genuinely exhausted, adenosine high, the weight of the whole day pressing towards sleep. And yet also wide open. Heart beating a little faster than it should. Thoughts moving rather than stilling. A sense that everything is slightly too present, too close, too loud. This is hyperarousal, and it is not the same as not being tired. You can be both at once. The adenosine is real, the exhaustion is real, and the arousal is also real, running alongside it, refusing to yield. Detlef Riemann and his colleagues, in a review published in Sleep Medicine Reviews in 2010, described hyperarousal as the central feature of insomnia. Not just cognitive hyperarousal, the busy mind, the running thoughts, but also somatic hyperarousal, a kind of heightened activation in the body, an elevated heart rate, a higher core temperature, a nervous system that is simply running hotter than sleep requires. And cortical hyperarousal, measurable in brain activity during sleep itself, in people who suffer from this state. The bed, they observed, can become a place the brain has learned to associate with wakefulness rather than rest, a site of threat monitoring rather than release. That last piece is worth sitting with. The bed itself can become the cue, not the darkness, not the lateness of the hour, the specific familiar place where you have lain awake, worrying on enough nights that the brain has quietly, unconsciously catalogued it as a place where alertness is required. You lie down and something in you braces. This was first described by the psychologist Richard Boutsin, and it became foundational to the treatments we'll come to later. The brain has learned, and what it has learned, it can learn differently. Now let's add one more layer to the chemistry of the wired night, because there is a second chemical at play, one that most people know by name but perhaps haven't thought about in quite this way. At bedtime, cortisol. You likely think of cortisol as the stress hormone, and you're not wrong. It is deeply involved in the body's response to stress and perceived threat, activating what is sometimes called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a chain of signals that runs from the brain through the pituitary gland down to the adrenal glands, prompting the release of cortisol into the bloodstream. But cortisol also has a circadian rhythm of its own, independent of stress. Under ordinary conditions in a healthy pattern, cortisol follows a beautiful arc across the 24-hour day. It is lowest around midnight and the early hours of sleep. It begins to rise through the second half of the night, and it peaks sharply in the 30 to 45 minutes after waking. A surge that Angela Clough and her colleagues at the University of Westminster studied carefully, calling it the cortisol awakening response. That morning, peak is part of what makes the morning feel like morning. It primes the brain for alertness. It prepares the body for the demands of a new day. It is, in its own way, a kind of internal sunrise. But here is what happens when you lie awake in the dark, mind-running loops. Research by Alexandros Gontsas and his colleagues, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2001, found that people with chronic insomnia showed elevated cortisol levels across the 24-hour day, including at the hours when cortisol should be at its lowest. The late night hours. The hours when the cortisol curve should be bottoming out, when the body should be receiving the chemical signal that now is the time to let go, to descend into rest. In people whose minds are running rumination, the HPA axis is being activated. Cortisol is being pushed upward at midnight, at 1 in the morning, at 2. Think about what that means. The very act of lying awake and worrying drives up the chemical that the body uses to signal readiness for waking. The cortisol that should be resting at its nadir is instead being nudged upward by the activation of the stress response. The body receives in the middle of the night something resembling a chemical message that it is time to be alert. And so it is. This is not a failure of willpower. This is not you trying to sleep wrong. This is a cascade, a chain of physical events, one following from another, as concrete and as unchosen as the way a river follows its valley. The rumination activates the HPA axis. The HPA axis releases cortisol. The cortisol contributes to arousal. The arousal competes with the adenosine-driven sleep pressure. And the two states coexist, genuinely tired, genuinely wired, neither one fully winning. Understanding this doesn't make the experience disappear, but it changes the texture of it. When you know that the wired feeling is cortisol, is the HPA axis responding to the content of your thoughts as though they were a physical emergency, there is a way to hold that with a little more distance. The body is responding to a perceived threat. The threat is, most often, a thought, a loop, an unresolved question that the mind keeps returning to, not because it's urgent in the way that a fire or a fever is urgent, but because unresolved things have a particular pull on the mind, and the mind at night, with no other tasks to perform, keeps returning to them. There is a reason for that pull too, and the person who first described it worked not in a sleep laboratory, but in a Berlin cafe nearly 100 years ago. Her name was Bluma Zeigarnik. She was a young psychologist studying in Berlin in the 1920s under the brilliant Kurt Lewin, and the story of how she came to her discovery is a small and particular one, the kind of story that feels almost too neat to be true, except that it is. She and Lewin were sitting in a busy restaurant, and she observed something about the waiters. The waiters, who carried complex orders in their heads and navigated the tables with impressive accuracy, could recall in vivid detail the orders of every table where the bill had not yet been settled. Every unpaid tab, every open order held precisely in memory. But the settled tables, the ones where the bill had been paid and the diners had gone, those they forgot almost immediately. The moment the transaction was complete, the order released from memory, as though the mind had been holding on specifically because the task was unfinished and let go the moment it was done. Zeigarnik took this observation back to the laboratory and ran a series of experiments published in 1927 in the journal Psychologische Forschung. She gave participants tasks, puzzles, small construction projects, simple activities, and interrupted some of them before completion while allowing others to finish. And when she tested recall later, the interrupted tasks were remembered roughly twice as often as the completed ones. The unfinished things persisted. The completed ones faded. She had found something that would come to carry her name: the Zeigarnik effect. The mind, it seems, holds on to open loops. It keeps a kind of internal list of unresolved things, and something in it keeps returning to that list, keeps nudging your awareness back toward the items on it, the way you might keep returning to a drawer you aren't sure you properly closed. The nudging doesn't stop until the item is resolved, or until something that feels like resolution arrives. And now think about what you carry into the night. All the things that didn't get finished today, the email you didn't send, the conversation that went somewhere unexpected and didn't quite land, the plan that was only half made, the worry that circled at lunch and got set aside because there was no time to address it, the decision that is still pending. Each of these is an open loop in the Zeigarnik sense. Each of them is generating a small persistent signal, unresolved. Return here. Don't let this go yet. In the daytime, with tasks and people and movement, those signals compete with 1,000 other inputs and mostly lose. But at night, lying still in the quiet, with nothing else demanding attention, every open loop in your mental list gets a clear channel. The mind can finally get to all the things it's been waiting all day to nudge you about. And it does, all of them, sometimes at once. It is not your mind turning against you. It is your mind trying, in its somewhat clumsy, relentless way, to do its job. The job of keeping track of the unfinished things. The problem is that the bedroom at midnight is not a good time to be doing that job, and the mind, for all its remarkable qualities, doesn't always have a fine sense of timing. But here is what makes this piece of the story more than just an explanation, more than just a way of understanding why the loop runs. The same line of research that gave us the Zeigarnik effect eventually pointed towards something else, something gentler and more useful. Roy Baumeister, the same Baumeister whose work on negativity bias we encountered earlier, and his colleague E.J. Masicampo published a study in 2011 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology with a title that reads, almost like a promise, "Consider it done." What they found in a series of careful experiments was that unfulfilled goals intrude on the mind and interfere with other ongoing tasks, exactly as you would expect from the Zeigarnik framework. The open loop keeps poking through. But then they found something else. When participants were asked not to complete the goal, but simply to make a specific plan for it, to write down when and how they would address it, the intrusions stopped. The mind, it seemed, didn't actually require completion. It required trust that completion was coming. A concrete plan with enough specificity to feel real was sufficient to release the hold. The loop could let go not because the thing was done, but because the mind had somewhere to put it. And this was confirmed a few years later in a study that brought these questions directly to the bedside. Michael Scullin and colleagues at Baylor University, in a paper published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, in 2018, asked one group of participants to spend 5 minutes before bed writing a list of things they had accomplished that day, and another group to spend the same 5 minutes writing a to-do list of the specific things they still needed to do in the coming days. The people who wrote about the future, who offloaded their open loops onto paper, fell asleep significantly faster than those who wrote about the past, and the more specific and detailed the to-do list, the faster sleep came. The mind doesn't need to hold its open loops once it trusts they are held elsewhere. You can write them down, hand them to the page, and the internal list keeper can, at least in part, stand down. This is not a cure for every sleepless night. It is one piece of a much larger picture. But it is a piece that follows directly and logically from the machinery we've been looking at together, from the Zeigarnik loop and from the way the resting mind, with no task to perform and no distraction to buffer it, keeps returning to what is unfinished. You can give the unfinished thing somewhere to live that isn't inside your head, and in doing so, you can give your head a little more room for the quiet that sleep needs. We'll come to the other techniques that follow from all of this machinery, the concrete, gentle ways of working with the tired but wired brain, with the loud amygdala and the weakened brakes, with the cortisol that shouldn't be rising and the loops that won't resolve. There are several of them, and they are not generic, not just because someone said they help, but because each one addresses a specific part of the mechanism we've been walking through together. But first, come back to this moment, this room, this breath. Whatever is on your mental list tonight, you may know exactly what it is, or it may be more of a general low hum of unresolved things. It will still be there in the morning, or rather, you will still be able to find it in the morning if you need to. Setting it down for now does not erase it. The page will remember, the morning will arrive, as it always does. And the mind that meets those things in the morning, rested, with a prefrontal cortex properly calibrated, with adenosine cleared and cortisol on its natural rising arc, is a genuinely better mind for the job, not a luckier mind, a functionally different one. You are not avoiding the thing by sleeping. You are becoming better equipped to meet it. Take a slow breath all the way down to the belly if you can reach it, and then let it go a little longer than feels natural. The exhale, the slow and complete one, is where the nervous system receives the signal to ease. Something about the length of the breath out relative to the breath in tells the body that the alert phase can soften. This is not a metaphor. It runs through the vagus nerve, which we'll come to in a little while. But for now, just let the breath lead. You don't have to solve anything tonight. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to understand everything we've talked about. You just have to rest here. The room is quiet. The list can wait. And the mind, underneath all that circling, all that looping and nudging and returning, the mind is tired. It is genuinely tired. The adenosine has been accumulating all day, and the body knows, even when the chemistry of stress and worry is competing with that knowledge, that rest is what is needed now. Let's pause here together before we continue. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the place where the body meets whatever is beneath it. The mattress, the pillow, the weighted sense of where you are. Nothing is required of you right now. No task is open in this moment. You can set the mental list down here in this pause, and when you're ready, gently, we will continue. There is a phrase people use, half laughing, half exhausted, when they describe the condition of lying in bed long after they should be asleep. Tired, but wired. It has the rhythm of a joke, but it describes something that is happening in the body in a very specific and entirely non-comedic way. It is not a metaphor, it is two separate systems running on two separate schedules, arriving at the same moment and pulling in opposite directions. And once you understand what each system actually is and why they collide the way they do, the phrase stops feeling like a rueful observation and starts feeling like a map. Let us begin with the tired half. All day, from the first moment you opened your eyes this morning, your brain has been producing a chemical called adenosine. It is a byproduct of neural activity, the cellular equivalent of exhaust, and it accumulates steadily in the spaces between neurons as your waking hours pass. Think of it like water rising very slowly in a room. By mid-afternoon, there is enough of it to make concentration feel slightly heavier than it did in the morning. By early evening, there is more. By the time you are lying in the dark, there is quite a lot. The body experiences this accumulation as sleep pressure, a term researchers use to describe the biological urgency that builds towards sleep over the course of a waking day. The scientist Alexander Borbély, working in the early 1980s, called this Process S, where S stands for sleep. It is the first of two processes he identified as governing when and how deeply we sleep. Process S is why, if you have been awake for 18 hours, the thought of lying down can feel almost physically compelling. The adenosine has done its patient chemical work. And yet, there is a second process. Borbély called it Process C, where C stands for circadian, from the Latin words meaning roughly around the day. The circadian system is your body's internal clock, a master rhythm that runs on approximately a 24-hour cycle and governs not just sleep but body temperature, hormone secretion, and alertness across the entire day. In the late morning, this clock is working to produce wakefulness and alertness. In the mid-afternoon, there is a small dip, the one that makes 3 p.m. feel like wading through shallow mud. Then the clock produces a second alerting signal in the early evening, a push of wakefulness that sleep researchers sometimes call the wake maintenance zone, the body's way of preventing you from falling asleep too early before the night is ready for you. In ordinary circumstances, these two processes cooperate. Process S rises steadily, and then the circadian clock, having done its evening maintenance push, eventually stands aside and lets the accumulated sleep pressure carry you under. The night opens, you fall. But there is a third element that Baumeister's clean, two-process model did not fully account for, because it runs on its own axis altogether. Stress arousal, sympathetic nervous system activation, the kind that happens when a mind, freed of its daytime tasks and left alone in the dark, begins to move through its own unresolved inventory. When you ruminate, when you cycle through the worry, the half-finished thought, the regret, the thing you should have said or didn't say, the thing waiting for you tomorrow that your mind keeps turning over like a stone, you are activating the body's alert system. And that system has a chemical signature. You can measure it in the blood, you can measure it in saliva. It is called cortisol, and what it does at night, in a person who is lying in bed unable to quiet their thoughts, is a near-perfect inversion of what it is supposed to do. Here is what cortisol is meant to do in a healthy cycle. It follows a circadian rhythm that runs in many ways opposite to what we might intuitively expect. During the night, during deep sleep, cortisol levels are at their lowest. They should be around midnight, near their floor for the entire 24-hour period. Then, as sleep continues into its second half, cortisol begins to rise, slowly at first, then more steeply. By the time you are approaching waking, it is climbing toward its daily peak. In the first 30 to 45 minutes after you open your eyes, it reaches that peak, a surge called the cortisol awakening response. This is your body preparing you for the day, sharpening alertness, mobilizing energy, making you capable of meeting whatever the morning brings. Angela Clow and her colleagues documented this pattern carefully, and it is now one of the best characterized features of circadian biology. Cortisol low at midnight, cortisol high at waking. What happens when you lie in the dark, rehearsing a worry? The thought activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a chain of signaling that runs from a small structure deep in the brain through the pituitary gland just beneath it, down to the adrenal glands sitting atop the kidneys. This chain, abbreviated to the HPA axis, is the body's stress response highway, and when it is triggered, it releases cortisol. Not a lot, not the dramatic surge of an acute emergency, but enough. Enough to lift cortisol at the precise hour it is biologically supposed to be at its lowest. Researchers, including Alexandros Vgontsas and his colleagues, found that people with chronic insomnia show elevated cortisol across the 24-hour period compared to people who sleep well, a sign that the HPA axis in poor sleepers is not fully resting when it should. The midnight mind, in other words, is doing something to the body's chemistry that the body did not design for midnight. Elevated cortisol at night means elevated arousal. It means a cardiovascular system that is slightly more activated than sleep requires. It means a brain that is tilted toward alertness and threat monitoring. It means that process S, all that accumulated adenosine pressing towards sleep, is competing not just with the circadian alerting signal of process C, but now with a third antagonist, the stress chemistry your own thoughts are generating. That is what tired but wired actually is. The tired is real, the adenosine is real. The body genuinely wants rest, has been signaling all evening that rest is needed. And at the same time, the wired is real too, not a personal failure, not an inexplicable malfunction, but a specific and understandable chemistry driven by a mind that found, in the silence and the dark, a set of unresolved thoughts and began doing what minds do with unresolved things. Turning them over, looking at them from new angles, checking them again. Not because something is wrong, but because that is what a mind, freed of external tasks and left to its own devices in the unstimulated night, will do. We laid out why in the earlier parts of this. The default mode network turns inward. The distraction buffer of daytime life dissolves. The thought that was crowded out at noon has the room to itself now. And to make things a little more precise, to make the picture just a little fuller, it is worth noting that there are two hormones running in something close to opposite phase at night, not one. Cortisol is one, Melatonin is the other. Melatonin is produced by the pineal gland, a small structure tucked near the center of the brain. It is sometimes called the darkness hormone, and that name is quite accurate. The pineal gland begins releasing melatonin in response to diminishing light, and the signal it sends is essentially a biological announcement. Darkness has arrived. Biological night has begun. Melatonin does not put you to sleep the way a sedative does. It is not primarily a sleeping drug. It is a timing signal. Its job is to synchronize the body's internal clock with the external cycle of light and dark, to say now is the time for rest, and to allow the other sleep-promoting systems to do their work in the right window. When melatonin is rising, cortisol is falling. When cortisol rises toward morning, melatonin has already been suppressed by the returning light. The two are not perfectly opposed in every individual, but broadly across the night, they pull in opposite directions, and the body needs melatonin's quiet signal to be heard clearly. One thing that interferes with it is light, specifically the short wavelength blue-tinted light that modern screens produce. When the eyes detect blue wavelength light in the evening, the signal reaches the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock, and what it tells the pineal gland is essentially, it is still daytime. Melatonin production is suppressed or delayed. The timing signal goes quiet. Anne-Marie Chang and her colleagues at Harvard published research in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2015 showing that people who read on light-emitting electronic devices in the evening, compared to those reading printed books, showed suppressed melatonin, later, sleep onset, reduced morning alertness, and a delay in their circadian rhythm. The device, held at arm's length in the dark room, was functioning as a small, close, very efficient artificial daylight, and the body believed it. There is another substance worth naming briefly as a kind of flavoring to this picture. Caffeine. Its mechanism is specific and germane to everything we have been discussing about adenosine. Caffeine works not by producing energy directly, but by blocking the adenosine receptors in the brain. It occupies the landing sites where adenosine would normally bind and accumulate, so the brain cannot sense the sleep pressure that is building. The fatigue is there, the adenosine is there, but the sensation of it is masked. When the caffeine eventually breaks down, that accumulated adenosine floods the receptors all at once, which is the sensation of the caffeine crash, the sudden fatigue that arrives when the blocker clears away. The important number here is the half-life. Caffeine has a half-life of approximately 5 to 6 hours. Christopher Drake and his colleagues published research in 2013 in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine showing that caffeine consumed 6 hours before bed still significantly disrupted sleep, which means a coffee at 4 in the afternoon has, by 10 at night, reduced to only half of its original amount in the body. Still present. Still, to a meaningful degree, telling the brain not to feel how tired it actually is. The wired half of Tired But Wired has, in many people, a caffeinated contributor that arrived at the morning meeting and is still lingering at midnight, quieting the very adenosine signal that should be carrying them into sleep. None of this is told to you as a reason to judge the afternoon coffee or the late evening scroll. The telling is for recognition. For the small, settling relief of understanding that what is happening in your body right now, if you are lying awake, is the result of several overlapping systems that are each doing something coherent and evolved. The HPA axis is doing exactly what it was designed to do when it detects a threat worth attending to. The circadian clock is doing its job. Adenosine is doing its patient, accumulating work. Melatonin is responding to the light signals it received. The only thing that is not working for you in this specific confluence is the timing. These systems are doing daytime things at nighttime. They are playing the wrong music for the hour. The hyperarousal model of insomnia, articulated by Dieter Riemann and his colleagues in Sleep Medicine Reviews in 2010, proposes exactly this. that the central feature of insomnia is not an absence of sleepiness, but an excess of arousal, cognitive arousal, the thinking and planning and looping, somatic arousal, the elevated heart rate, the muscle tension, the alertness in the body, and cortical arousal, the heightened, activated state of the brain itself. In people who struggle chronically with sleep, Riemann's model suggests the arousal systems have become chronically overactivated, and the result is a brain and body that can be simultaneously loaded with sleep pressure and stuck in a state of wakefulness. The bed, over time, can begin to function as a cue for arousal rather than for rest. You lie down and something in the nervous system recognizes this place as the place where lying awake happens and helpfully prepares you for the experience. A kind of learning in reverse, where the location and position that should signal sleep has instead become associated with the watchfulness and worry that sleep consistently brought. Riemann and others describe this as a hypervigilance, a background threat monitoring that keeps the system lit in a place that should be dark. And it is in this context, this specific and somewhat crowded landscape of competing chemistries and learned associations and a mind that has been handed an inventory of unresolved things that we come to something remarkable about the nature of unfinished thoughts themselves. It begins with a waiter. The story comes from Berlin, sometime around 1920. A young woman named Bluma Zygarnik was having dinner, or perhaps coffee, with her academic mentor, a psychologist named Kurt Lewin, who was already one of the more perceptive observers of human behavior in Europe. And one of them, the accounts differ slightly on which, noticed something about the waiters serving them. The waiters could remember a complicated order, a long table full of courses, drinks, modifications, specific requests entirely in their heads without writing anything down, not remarkable for a skilled waiter. The remarkable thing was what happened after. Once the table had finished, once the bill was settled and the meal was complete, the order evaporated from the waiter's memory almost immediately. You could ask the waiter 5 minutes later what the table in the corner had ordered, and the waiter would not know. The order was simply gone. But an uncompleted order, a table still in the middle of its meal, a bill not yet settled, those the waiters held with complete, unencumbered clarity. Lewin recognized this as something worth studying. Zygarnik, his student, went back to the laboratory and ran a series of experiments testing exactly this pattern. She gave people tasks to complete, interrupted some before they finished, let others run to completion, and then asked everyone to recall what they had been doing. The interrupted, unfinished tasks were recalled approximately twice as often as the completed ones. The mind was holding on to the open things, not because it was trying to cause trouble, but because it had not yet received the signal that the task was done. The loop was still open. The goal was still active. And so the mental resources that had been allocated to that task remained allocated, attentive, checking in, nudging, available, still waiting for a resolution that had not come. Bluma Zygarnik published this in 1927, and the pattern has carried her name ever since. The Zygarnik effect. Now apply this to the mind lying in the dark. The day contains, for most people, a genuinely large number of open loops, things said but not fully processed, a conversation that ended oddly, an email that needs a response and hasn't gotten one, a plan still forming, a worry about a thing not yet resolved, a task started but unfinished, a decision pending, an apology still waiting to be made or received. These are all, in the cognitive sense, unpaid bills. The mind has allocated resources to them. And the mind, quite naturally, quite predictably, is going to keep checking in on them. The question it is functionally asking over and over is this done yet? Is there a resolution? Can I release the resources I've been holding for this? At 2 in the morning, the answer to that question is no. No, it is not done. The email has not been answered. The conversation has not been revisited. The plan is still unformed, and so the mind keeps returning, not because it is anxious in some clinical or permanent sense, because it has unfinished business and has not yet received what it needs in order to set that business down. And here is where the research takes a turn that is genuinely one of the most clarifying and practically useful things that cognitive psychology has produced on this subject. Roy Baumeister, who you may remember from the negativity bias work we discussed earlier, collaborated with E.J. Masicampo on a series of experiments published in 2011 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology under the title "Consider It Done." Their central question was, what exactly causes an unfulfilled goal to keep intruding on consciousness? The popular assumption might be that only completing the task would stop the intrusion. But Masicampo and Baumeister found something more specific and more interesting than that. It was not completion that quieted the loop. It was having a plan. They showed that when people formed a specific, concrete plan for how and when they would address an unfinished goal, the intrusive thoughts about that goal dropped significantly, even though nothing about the goal itself had changed. The task was still undone, the email was still unsent, the conversation was still unresolved, but because the mind now held a trusted, specific plan for addressing it, the mental resources that had been on standby, waiting, checking in, nudging, could be stood down. Something like, I know what happens next, I know when, I know how, I can let go of this until then. The mind, Masicampo and Baumeister suggested, does not need the task to be finished. It needs to trust that the task will not fall through the cracks of time. It needs an arrangement, a commitment, a specific and credible next step. The checking, the looping, the 2 a.m. return to the same territory is not failure. It is the mind doing something entirely rational, keeping an active ledger of the things that matter and that have not yet been secured. The way to close that ledger is not to force the thoughts away which we have already seen does not work. The instruction to stop thinking has nowhere for the thinking to go. The way to close the ledger is to give the mind what it is actually asking for. An answer to, is this handled? A plan that is real and specific enough that the mental record keeper can mark it as accounted for. This is not just a theory, it has been taken directly into a sleep laboratory. Michael Scullin and his colleagues at Baylor University ran an experiment published in 2018 in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, which tested exactly this in the context of bedtime. Participants spent 5 minutes writing before going to sleep. One group wrote about tasks they had already completed that day. The other group wrote a list of tasks still to be done, upcoming things, the open loops. And the researchers measured how long it took each group to fall asleep. The group that wrote about upcoming tasks, the specific and detailed to-do list of the things not yet done, fell asleep significantly faster. And the more specific the list was, the stronger the effect. Not because writing down the tasks completed them, but because writing them down in a specific and actionable form did something the mind needed done before it could rest. It created a record. It said, in effect, these are held. They are here, on this paper, waiting. I know what they are. I know I will return to them. And the mind, receiving that signal, loosened its grip on the inventory it had been holding. There is something quite beautiful in this when you hold it next to the Zeigarnik effect and the waiter story from a century earlier. The waiter, who could remember every open order and forget every closed one, was demonstrating the same system. What closes the mental file is not the resolution of the thing itself. It is the trusted sense that the thing is accounted for, that it is not going to be lost in the night, that it is somewhere safe. Writing the list is a way of saying to the part of your mind that has been keeping watch, you can rest now. I've got this. I've written it down. It will be there in the morning, which is a gentler and more accurate instruction than stop thinking, because stop thinking offers the mind nowhere to go and no assurance that anything is being held. The list offers an answer, a landing place, a small act of care for the worried part of you that has been doing its best in its own exhausting and circular way to make sure nothing important gets dropped. So if you find yourself in the dark tonight, returning again to the same thought, the same open loop, the same unpaid bill of a worry, it might help to know that the returning is not a flaw. It is a feature of a mind that has not yet received what it needs. And what it needs is quite specific and quite small. A plan, an arrangement, a note on the paper by the bed, or a voice memo, or the simplest acknowledgement that tomorrow, at a real time, in a real place, you will take a real step. That is all the keeper of the ledger is asking for, not resolution, not certainty. Just, I know what happens next. Take a slow, deep breath. In through the nose, if that is comfortable, and out through the mouth, a little longer than the breath in. Not forced, not controlled beyond what is easy. Just a little slower on the way out than the way in. The body knows this signal. The extended exhale, a breath that runs out longer than the breath that came in, travels along the vagus nerve, the long wandering nerve that connects the brain to the heart and the lungs and the gut, and it tells the heart to slow just slightly. The heart rate lowers. The nervous system, in its very old and pre-verbal language, receives the message that the alert phase can ease. This is not a metaphor we are offering here. The mechanism is real, the nerve is real, the slowing is measurable. We will come to the science of it in a little while, but for now, simply let the breath show you what it already knows how to do. You don't need to hold anything right now. Whatever is on the list is on the list. The things that are unresolved will still be unresolved in the morning, but they will be there. They will not have been lost. The night does not erase the things that matter. It only holds them in the dark until the light comes back. Let yourself be still for a moment. Not the stillness of effort, not the clenched quiet of someone trying very hard to sleep, but the softer kind of stillness that comes when the body simply rests in the position it is already in and allows the breath to move through it without interference. The room is quiet. You are safe here. When you are ready, we will continue together. There is a word that sleep researchers use for the transition into sleep, the threshold between waking and sleeping, the few minutes when the ordinary, narrative, connected mind begins to dissolve into something looser and more associative and less organized. The word is hypnagogia. It comes from the Greek for sleep and leading. The hypnagogic state is that strange corridor where waking thought loses its structure, where images appear that have no logical relationship to one another, where a face becomes a landscape, becomes a color, becomes a sound, where the sense of having a coherent, continuous self gently loosens its grip. Most people have experienced it, even if they would not have known to call it that. It is the moment when you catch yourself thinking something quite strange, something that has no obvious connection to the thought before it, and you surface briefly into awareness thinking, where did that come from? And then, if all is well, you sink back under and the loosening continues and sleep proper begins. The reason this is worth naming here is that it helps clarify what rumination is actually preventing. Healthy sleep onset requires the coherent, narrative, self-referential, problem-solving mind to dissolve. It needs the inner storyteller, the one who is tracking the thread of your day and connecting it to the thread of your worries about tomorrow, to let go of the thread. The hypnagogic state is the dissolution of that grip, and rumination is the opposite of dissolution. Rumination is grip. It is the mind tightening its hold on the thread, returning to it, checking it, following it back to the beginning and then again to the end. Every time the mind circles back to the worry, it is reasserting its organization, its narrative coherence, its very wide awakeness. It is doing the opposite of what sleep onset requires. This is why, paradoxically, the experience of lying awake worrying can be so exhausting without being restful. The body is still, the room is dark, the eyes are closed, and yet the mind is engaged in something cognitively intensive. It is maintaining and monitoring an active narrative. The self-referential processing that the default mode network is built for, the reviewing and projecting and evaluating and connecting, that is the signature of the wandering, inward-turned mind, is work. Not the kind of work that feels like effort in the way that lifting something heavy feels like effort, but work in the sense of consuming resources, processing, running loops, and none of that work, however genuinely well-intentioned in its own way, is helping the mind dissolve into the loose, illogical drift that sleep needs. There is a technique developed by a cognitive scientist named Luc Baudouin that addresses this very specifically. He called it serial diverse imagining, though you may also encounter it under the name cognitive shuffling. The idea is elegant and strange and somewhat counterintuitive, and its rationale is grounded in exactly what we have just been discussing. Instead of trying to stop the worrying mind directly, which tends to be futile for reasons we have now established at some length, you deliberately give the mind something else to do, not something meaningful or narrative or connected, something random and disconnected, a kind of deliberate cognitive nonsense. You pick a word, any word, something simple and concrete, say the word coat, and you call up an image of a coat. You hold it for a moment. Then you let it go and call up something entirely unrelated, a stone, a river, a bicycle leaning against a fence, a dog you saw once, a cup, a green door. You are not trying to build a story with these images. You are deliberately moving between them without connection, without narrative, without the thread of meaning that the worrying mind would normally construct. Baudouin's reasoning is that this kind of loose, disconnected, randomly associative imagery mimics what the mind naturally does in the hypnagogic state, the very drift it needs to enter sleep. By producing this pattern deliberately, you are effectively meeting the mind where sleep onset wants to take it, giving the narrative, self-referential mind a kind of decoy to dissolve around. The coherent thread cannot easily be maintained while the mind is hopping imagelessly from coat to stone to bicycle to door. The grip loosens, and the loosening, if you do not chase it back by returning to the worry, can continue into sleep. The formal evidence for cognitive shuffling as a clinical intervention is still being gathered. It is a relatively young technique, but its mechanism is well grounded in what we understand about sleep onset and rumination, and many people find it useful precisely because it asks for engagement rather than suppression. It does not say stop. It says do this instead, and doing this instead is, cognitively, a very different and much more achievable instruction. There is another layer to the picture of what is happening when you lie awake, one that ties back to everything we have covered about the negativity bias and the depleted prefrontal cortex. And it has to do with a very old part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala, two small almond-shaped structures tucked deep in the temporal lobes, one on each side, is the brain's fast response alarm system. Its job, refined over millions of years, is to detect threats quickly and initiate a response before the slower, reasoning parts of the brain have had time to fully assess the situation. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux called this the low road, the fast, direct pathway from the sense organs to the amygdala that allows a fear response to begin before the cortex has even finished identifying what it is reacting to. The amygdala acts first, the cortex catches up later. This is useful when the threat is physical and immediate. The sound in the dark that might be a threat is better responded to now and thought about later. But when the threat is an unresolved conversation or an uncertain future, or a worry that exists primarily in the form of a thought, the amygdala's speed is not a feature, it is the thing that makes a 2 a.m. Fear feels viscerally, undeniably, physically true before the slower, reasoning cortex has had a chance to say, wait, let's look at this more carefully. The emotional charge arrives first. The assessment comes later, if it comes at all, which in a depleted midnight brain, often it does not. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the part called the medial prefrontal cortex, sits in a regulatory relationship with the amygdala. It does not suppress the alarm, it contextualizes it. It adds the information that a noise in the dark might be the house settling, that a catastrophic feeling thought about tomorrow might be a catastrophic feeling thought, not a prophecy, that the thing which feels undeniably urgent right now might feel considerably less so in the morning. This regulatory function, this contextualizing, is slow and metabolically costly and requires a well-rested, adequately supplied prefrontal cortex to do its work. And at night, in a person who is tired, the prefrontal cortex is running low. We discussed this in the earlier section on the negativity bias and the work of Matthew Walker and his colleagues, published in Current Biology in 2007, showing that sleep deprivation significantly amplifies amygdala reactivity to negative stimuli while weakening the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The regulator is partially offline. The alarm is louder, and the contextualization that would ordinarily arrive to soften the alarm to say yes, but consider that is coming slowly, if at all. The result is a thought that feels undeniably true, urgent, heavy. The kind of thought you can feel in the chest, not just in the mind, not because it is true with more certainty than it will be in the morning, but because the mechanism that would usually arrive to temper the feeling is working at reduced capacity. The thought is not truer at midnight. It is louder, it is felt more viscerally, and the brain's ability to say, let's hold on a moment and assess this carefully, is not at its best. There is something called affect labeling that Matthew Lieberman and his colleagues at UCLA studied and published in Psychological Science in 2007 under the title Putting Feelings into Words. Lieberman found that the act of naming an emotion, simply identifying it and giving it a word, actually reduces amygdala activity. It recruits the prefrontal cortex, specifically the areas involved in verbal processing and regulation, and that recruitment does something measurable. The emotional charge of the experience is lowered, not eliminated, lowered. The feeling is still there, but it is held now in the context of language, rather than in the raw, wordless charge of the amygdala's alarm. This is why, in many therapeutic and meditative traditions, the instruction to name what you are feeling is not just poetic or symbolic. It has a mechanism. When you say, even quietly in your own mind, this is anxiety, or this is the thought that I might fail, or I notice that I am afraid right now, you are doing something that the prefrontal cortex can participate in. You are building a small bridge between the alarm and the reasoning mind. And the act of building that bridge, of putting the wordless feeling into words, appears to lower the volume of the alarm itself. So the thought that is cycling at 2 a.m., the one that keeps arriving and feels so insistent, might become, with this small act of naming, this is the thought that I haven't done enough, or this is the worry about tomorrow, or I notice that I am lying here with my chest tight and my mind busy, not as an instruction to do anything about it, not as a problem to solve, simply as a naming. A meeting of the experience with language rather than with resistance or with agreement. Because the other thing that does not help, though it is entirely understandable, is the arguing. When the 2 a.m. thought arrives and says everything is wrong, the exhausted mind often responds by trying to argue, to counter it with evidence, to construct a case for why it is not true. And this is cognitively a conversation. A real and effortful negotiation with a thought that does not operate by the rules of rational debate because it is not, at this hour, primarily a rational phenomenon. It is an amygdala alarm wearing the clothes of a logical concern. Arguing with it keeps you awake and rarely resolves it. Naming it is different from arguing with it. Naming says, I see you, I know what you are, I am not agreeing with you and I am not fighting you. I am simply noting that you are here, and I am noting that the hour is late, and I am noting that I do not have to resolve you tonight. The 2 a.m. thought, named and set aside rather than argued with or pursued, often quiets, not always immediately. But the naming removes the escalation. It gives the prefrontal cortex something to do that is within its current limited capacity. And it treats the thought as a thought rather than as a verdict. You are right now somewhere in a bed or a room with a mind that may or may not be quiet, and whatever is moving through it tonight, whatever is circling back or sitting heavily or presenting itself as more urgent than the hour can properly contain. It is doing what minds do. It is doing what a mind does that has been handed a list of unresolved things and left alone in the dark without the distraction of the day to carry them away. This is not a failing. There is no version of this that is a sign that something is wrong with you specifically. The systems we have been describing tonight, the default mode network turning its attention inward when tasks fall away, the negativity bias amplified by a cortex running low on sleep, the HPA axis lifting cortisol at the hour it should be its quietest, the Zeigarnik effect keeping the mental ledger open on every unfinished thing. These are systems that are billions of years and millions of humans in the making. They did not arrive in you. You arrived in them. Everyone lying in a quiet, dark room with a tired body and an active mind is arriving in exactly the same systems, shaped by exactly the same evolutionary pressures, experiencing exactly the same collision of processes designed for different times of day. You are not unusual in this. You are not broken by it. You are simply here in the dark with a very human mind. And there is something that is going to happen while you sleep tonight that addresses at a level deeper than any of the techniques we have touched on or are about to come to, the emotional weight of what the day has left behind. We will come to it fully in the part of this that follows. But let it rest here as a small promise. The night is not just the absence of the day. It is doing something specific and repair-like with the things the day deposited, something that is only possible in sleep, in a particular kind of sleep, in a particular chemical state that only arrives in certain stages of the night. The morning does not simply begin fresh by convention or by force of will. It begins fresh, in part, because of something that has been quietly and precisely done while you were not aware of it. That is where we are going. But for now, let us pause here together before we continue. Take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of the body settling, the particular quality of stillness in the room. Notice, if you like, the temperature of the air, the sounds that are present, and the sounds that are not. The list of unresolved things is still out there, still real, still waiting in the way that tomorrow waits, but they are not required of you right now. Nothing is required of you right now. The only thing happening in this moment is a breath moving in and a breath moving out, a little longer on the way out, and a body resting in the dark. You don't need to have understood everything. You don't need to have remembered the names or the years or the mechanisms. If something has settled a little, if the machinery of the night mind feels a little less mysterious and a little more like what it actually is, something explicable, something shared, something not aimed at you personally, then that is enough. That is more than enough. When you are ready, gently, we will continue. So, we have arrived here together at the part of the night where understanding wants to become something you can actually use. And that is fitting because everything we have looked at, the default mode network, turning its quiet spotlight inward the moment the day's tasks fall away, the negativity bias running louder in a brain whose prefrontal brakes have softened with tiredness, the cortisol that should be resting at its lowest point but rises instead when rumination feeds the HPA axis, the Zeigarnik loop, refusing to release what it does not yet trust is handled. All of that, every piece of it, is not just an explanation. It is a map. And a map is useful precisely because it tells you where the paths are. The techniques that actually help with nighttime overthinking are not random. They are not a grab bag of wellness suggestions assembled by people who mean well but are guessing. When you understand the mechanism, the techniques fall out of it almost naturally. Like consequences, they address specific things. Each one speaks to a particular part of the system that we have been walking through. So let us go through them that way gently, one by one, not as a list to memorize, but as a set of small, logical completions, each one answering a piece of the picture we have been building together. The first, and perhaps the most empirically grounded of all of them, is also the simplest, and it was confirmed by a study done at Baylor University, published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology in 2018. Michael Scullin and his colleagues asked participants to do one of two things before bed. One group wrote about everything they had already accomplished during the day. The other group wrote a detailed to-do list of the things still ahead, the things not yet finished, the tasks waiting on the other side of sleep. And the researchers measured how quickly people fell asleep. The to-do list group fell asleep significantly faster, not a little faster, meaningfully faster, and the effect was stronger when the lists were more specific. Vague intentions did not help as much as concrete plans. Writing down, call the insurance company about the claim from November at 9 in the morning on Thursday using the reference number on the letter worked better than writing deal with insurance. This connects directly to what Mazzucampo and Baumeister found in 2011, which we talked about earlier. The mind, they discovered, keeps poking at an unfinished goal, not because it is anxious in the ordinary sense, but because it is performing a kind of vigilance function. It is monitoring, it is doing its job, which is to make sure important things do not get lost. And the monitoring stops, the intrusion quiets, not when the task is done, but when the mind trusts that a plan exists. A specific plan, one it can believe in. The thought does not need to be resolved, it needs to be housed. When you write the thought down, when you give it a time and a name and a next step, the mind releases its grip. Not because anything has changed in the world, but because the internal alarm has received what it was looking for. You can think of the notepad on the bedside table as a kind of external working memory, a place where the loop can rest instead of running. You are not dismissing the worry, you are honoring it enough to give it a place to wait until morning. Take a slow breath there. Feel that settle if it wants to. Now, there is a broader framework that holds many of these techniques together, and it is worth naming because it carries a particular kind of authority that is genuinely reassuring. In 2016, the American College of Physicians, one of the most established medical bodies in the United States, published a formal clinical practice guideline authored by Kasim and colleagues on the management of chronic insomnia in adults. Their recommendation was clear and it was striking. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, known as CBTI, should be used as the first-line treatment for chronic insomnia disorder in adults, first line, ahead of medication. Not as a last resort after pills stop working, but before pills are even considered. This matters for a reason that goes beyond the question of what to take. It matters because it tells you what the people who study sleep most carefully believe about the nature of the problem. If overthinking at night was simply a chemical deficiency, a gap in the brain's sedative machinery, then the solution would be chemical. But the guidelines position reflects something else, that a significant part of what keeps people awake is learned, is cognitive, is a pattern of thinking and behavior that can be unlearned and redirected. The brain got itself into a loop. The The brain can, with the right guidance, find its way back out. That is, in its own way, a deeply encouraging thing to know. You are not broken, you are responding to something, and the response can shift. CBTI includes several distinct components, and the one called stimulus control has a deceptively simple logic. It was developed by Richard Bootsin, and the core idea is this. Your nervous system is exquisitely good at learning associations. If you spend enough nights lying in bed worrying, trying to force sleep, staring at the ceiling while your thoughts race, the bed itself begins to become a trigger. The body starts to associate the bed with wakefulness and anxiety rather than with sleep. The sight of the pillow, the feel of the sheets, the particular dark of the room. These things start to cue the worried, alert state rather than the drowsy one. And this association, once established, is self-reinforcing in a deeply frustrating way. You get into bed because you want to sleep. Getting into bed triggers wakefulness. Wakefulness triggers worry about not sleeping. Worry makes sleep harder, and the association deepens. The stimulus control approach addresses this directly. If you have been lying awake for roughly 15 or 20 minutes and sleep has not come, the instruction is get up, leave the bed, go to another room, do something quiet and calm in dim light, reading something that is gentle rather than stimulating, sitting, listening to something soft. Wait until you feel genuinely sleepy. The specific heaviness in the eyes and the body that is actual sleep pressure rising, and then return to bed. The goal is to break the association, to reteach the nervous system that the bed is for sleep, not for lying awake and worrying. It takes time, it takes a few nights, sometimes more. And it feels counterintuitive because when you cannot sleep, the last thing that seems wise is to spend less time in bed. But the logic is sound and the evidence supports it, and knowing the logic can help it feel less like an arbitrary instruction and more like what it is, which is a targeted correction of a learned pattern. Let us rest there for a moment. Breathe slowly. Nothing to do with this right now, except let it be a piece of the picture. There is another technique within the CBTI family that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it, and yet the evidence for it is real. It is called paradoxical intention. And the principle is exactly what the name suggests. Instead of trying to fall asleep, you try to stay awake. You lie in bed, in the dark, with your eyes open, and you make a gentle effort to remain conscious. Not a strained effort, not a willful, clenched wakefulness, but a quiet, permissive attempt to stay awake. You give yourself permission not to sleep. The psychologist Colin Espy, who has contributed enormously to our understanding of insomnia, developed what he calls the attention-intention-effort pathway to explain how the loop of sleeplessness sustains itself. The model suggests that people who struggle with sleep begin to pay excessive attention to sleep, monitoring it, watching for signs of it or absence of it, the way you might watch a pot waiting for it to boil. They form explicit intentions around sleep, making sleep itself a goal that must be achieved, and they exert effort towards sleep, trying to make it happen. The problem is that sleep is one of those states that cannot be directly produced by effort. It has to be allowed. It happens in the absence of trying, and the very act of trying, the monitoring, the intention, the effort, creates arousal. It keeps the system awake. Paradoxical intention removes the effort. When you stop trying to sleep, when you give yourself genuine permission to simply lie quietly awake, the performance anxiety dissolves. The arousal that was being sustained by the effort of trying starts to ease. And in that easing, sleep often comes anyway, quietly, when it is no longer being forced. You were not failing to sleep because something was wrong with you. You were failing to sleep because you were trying too hard, which is a particularly human kind of problem and, in its way, a rather tender one. Now, here is one that feels almost playful, and it has a beautiful logic to it, once you understand what is happening at the moment of sleep onset. A cognitive scientist named Luc Baudouin developed a technique he calls serial diverse imagining, sometimes referred to as cognitive shuffling. The idea emerged from thinking carefully about what the mind is actually doing in those moments just before sleep takes hold. Healthy sleep onset has a characteristic quality. The thoughts that drift through the mind in those transitional moments, the state called hypnagogia, are not coherent. They are not narrative. They are fragments, disconnected images, a shoe, a field, someone's face briefly and without context, a color, a sound, a word that doesn't connect to anything. They are loose, almost random, certainly not logically linked. This dissolution of coherent narrative thought is, in a sense, a necessary feature of falling asleep. The organized, story-making mind has to loosen its grip. Things have to become incoherent before sleep can settle. Rumination is the exact opposite of this. Rumination is tightly coherent. It is narrative. It follows a logical chain. One thought leads inevitably to the next, which leads to the next, a sequence that is in some ways organized precisely because it has been rehearsed. The looping mind at midnight is an orderly mind, and that orderliness is part of what keeps it awake. What Baudouin proposed was a way to deliberately interrupt that coherence. Rather than fighting the thoughts directly, rather than trying to suppress them, which as we know tends to amplify them, you can give the mind something genuinely incoherent to do instead. You choose a word, almost any word will do, and you begin to generate images from it one by one, slowly. Say the word is apple, you might picture an apple, and then rather than continuing with apple-related thoughts, you let the mind hop to something entirely unrelated. A bridge, and then a candle, and then a dog, and then snow, and then a key. Each image is brief, loose, not connected to the one before. You are, in effect, generating the incoherence of hypnagogia deliberately, seeding it, giving the mind a template of the fragmentation that precedes sleep rather than the tight logic that sustains wakefulness. The formal evidence for this specific technique is still modest, as with any newly developed approach, but the rationale is grounded in what we do know about sleep onset and about the way suppression of thought tends to backfire. And many people find it helps, not because they have read the research, but because generating disconnected images is simply incompatible with sustaining a coherent worry chain. You cannot ruminate about the conversation you need to have with your manager while simultaneously picturing, loosely and without attachment, a boat, and then a window, and then a red coat hanging on a door. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the body sink a little further. There is no rush. We should talk about what happens when you name the thought. There is a study from 2007 conducted by Matthew Lieberman and his colleagues at UCLA, published in the journal Psychological Science, with a title that is itself a kind of small gift, putting feelings into words. What they found was this. When people put their emotional experiences into words, when they label what they are feeling, activity in the amygdala decreases. The amygdala, that threat-detecting structure that runs on the fast road, that generates the physical sensation of fear and urgency before the slower cortex has had a chance to appraise the situation, quiets when the experience is named. Affect labeling, they called it. The prefrontal cortex, when given the task of finding a word for the feeling, appears to do some of its regulatory work in the process. The act of naming recruits exactly the structure that is meant to temper the alarm. In practice, this is gentle and quiet. It does not require writing or a therapist or anything elaborate. It can happen in the dark, in your own mind, or whispered softly. Something like, I notice I am anxious about the conversation I have not had yet. I notice I am replaying what was said this afternoon and feeling the particular ache of something unresolved. I notice that my chest is tight and my breathing is shallow. You are not analyzing, you are not solving, you are naming, And the name, it turns out, is not nothing. The name is a form of prefrontal engagement, however small, and that engagement begins gently to moderate the signal. In the language of what we have been discussing throughout this night, the amygdala's threat signal is fast and loud and reaches consciousness before reason does. The prefrontal cortex is meant to look at that signal and assess it, to say, this is real, or this is a remnant, this requires action, or this can wait until morning. But at midnight, the prefrontal cortex is depleted, its regulatory influence weakened by tiredness. Naming the thought is a small way of nudging it back into the circuit, a soft prompt to the part of your brain that can, even now, even tired, even in the dark, begin the process of placing the alarm in its proper proportion. And underneath all of this, running through it, available at any moment, is the breath. Researchers Paul Lehrer and Richard Gevirtz, and separately, a team including Andrea Zaccaro and colleagues who published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience in 2018, have mapped what slow, deliberate breathing does to the nervous system. When you breathe at roughly 5 to 6 breaths per minute, which is much slower than the automatic rate of 15 or so breaths per minute that most people maintain when resting, something happens in the communication between the breath and the heart. Heart rate variability increases. The vagus nerve, the long wandering nerve that runs from the brainstem down through the chest and abdomen, is stimulated by the slower rhythm. The vagus nerve is the main highway of the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest counterpart to the sympathetic fight-or-flight system that has been running a little too loudly tonight. When the vagus is stimulated by slow, conscious breathing, it carries a signal downward and throughout the body. The emergency is over. The heart rate slows, the muscles ease, the body receives from inside itself the message that the threat has passed, even if the thought that triggered the threat is still technically unresolved. The particular shape of the breath matters here. A longer exhale is more effective than an even inhale and exhale. This is because the exhale activates the parasympathetic system more directly than the inhale does. So a breath that goes in for a count of 4 and out for a count of 6 or 7 or 8 is doing more to ease the arousal than a symmetrical breath. You do not need to count. You do not need to be precise. The principle is simply let the out-breath be longer and slower than the in-breath. Let it drain out rather than pushing it. And then wait just a moment in the quiet at the bottom of the exhale before the next breath begins. You can do this now if you like. A slow breath in, and then a long, slow breath out, longer than the in, emptying gently, no rush. And then the small pause, and then again. There is nothing to do here, except let the breath do what it knows how to do. The Black and colleagues' study published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2015 found that mindfulness meditation training improved sleep quality in older adults with sleep disturbance, significantly more than did sleep hygiene education alone. This is meaningful not as a finding that demands you take up a formal meditation practice, but as a confirmation that the direction of attention matters. Turning attention gently toward the present, toward the breath, toward the physical sensations of the body resting is a skill, and it is a learnable one, and it works in part because it gives the default mode network, that inward turning self-referential system, something specific and immediate to anchor to rather than the past and the future. Edmund Jacobson developed progressive muscle relaxation in the early 20th century, and it has remained a part of the toolkit for sleep precisely because it does something that purely cognitive techniques cannot always do on their own. When the worry is running in the mind, the body is also involved. The shoulders are slightly raised. The jaw is not quite unclenched. The hands have a faint tension in them that was not consciously put there. The physical state of the body and the mental state of the mind are in constant communication, and a body that is carrying residual tension sends signals upward that keep the system in a higher state of arousal than it needs to be. Progressive muscle relaxation works by systematically tensing and then releasing different muscle groups, moving through the body slowly, feet to calves, to thighs, to abdomen, to hands, to arms, to shoulders, to face. The deliberate contrast between tension and release teaches the body in a very direct way what relaxation actually feels like. It gives the nervous system a concrete reference point for letting go. You can do this loosely without a formal script. Just notice for a moment where you are holding something, the hands, the shoulders, the muscles around the eyes. Without forcing anything, invite those places to soften, not because you are commanding them, but because you are noticing them. And noticing is often enough. And so we arrive at the final piece of this picture, the one that is perhaps the most comforting of all. You have been lying awake with something that feels enormous. You know by now that the enormity is not a measure of the thing itself, but of the hour, of the depleted prefrontal cortex, of the amygdala running its signal without adequate dampening, of the negativity bias that makes the darkness feel more dangerous than it is, of the cortisol that rose when it should have fallen, of the tired but wired chemistry of a system caught between sleep pressure and stress arousal. You know by now that the thought is not more true at midnight, it is just louder. But here is the thing that can perhaps let you set it down for tonight. Sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness. It is an active process. The brain during sleep, particularly during the stage called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, which tends to dominate the later hours of the night, the second half, the hours toward morning, is doing something specific with the emotional weight of the day's experiences. Matthew Walker, and before him, the researcher Els van der Helm, who collaborated with his lab, described this as the overnight therapy hypothesis. And what they found is something genuinely remarkable. During REM sleep, the brain replays and reprocesses emotional memories. It does this in a chemical environment unlike any other state the brain occupies across the 24-hour cycle. Noradrenaline, the stress-related neurochemical, the one that is involved in the physiological experience of threat and urgency, the one that contributes to the visceral feeling of fear, drops to virtually zero during REM sleep. The brain is, during this stage, essentially free of the chemical that makes emotional experience feel urgent and alarming, and it is in this peculiar noradrenaline quiet state that the emotional memories of the day are revisited. The information, the facts of what happened, the details of the conversation, the content of the worry is retained. But the emotional charge, the sharp, pressing, this is a crisis quality of the feeling, is gradually reduced. You wake in the morning knowing what happened, but the knowing carries less weight. The edge is softer. What felt at 2 in the morning like a disaster that would define everything is more likely, after sleep, to feel like a difficulty. Something to be dealt with, yes, but manageable, proportionate. The morning is not a lie covering over the midnight feeling. The morning is a more accurate reading because the brain has done its repair work in the interval. And there is a second piece to the morning's clarity that we have touched on earlier. After sleep, the connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala is restored. The regulatory relationship between the thinking, reasoning part of the brain and the threat-detecting, alarm-sounding part is re-established. You and colleagues found this in 2007, measuring the amygdala responses of sleep-deprived versus rested participants. Sleep loss produces what Walker has described as a 60% increase in amygdala reactivity. Sleep, on the other hand, restores the prefrontal modulation. The rested brain is a brain where the alarm and the assessor are back in communication, where the feeling of urgency is met fairly quickly by a cortex that can say, "This is real, but not catastrophic. We have resources. We know some things. We can begin." And the body itself supports this. The cortisol awakening response, that natural rise in cortisol that begins in the second half of the night and peaks roughly 30 to 45 minutes after waking, is not just a chemical curiosity. It is part of the body's preparation for action. Cortisol in this context is not the enemy. It is the body saying morning is coming, capacity is returning, the time for lying still in the dark is over, and the time for moving through the world is beginning. The very thing that was being pushed out of phase by nighttime rumination, the cortisol that was rising when it should have been resting, now rises at the right time for the right reason, and it meets a brain that has, during the night's sleep, processed what needed processing. The catastrophe of midnight meets the morning's cortisol, not as a threat to be flooded, but as a task to be approached. The same worry, the same facts, a different brain, a different chemistry, a different time of day. And the experience of the worry is genuinely different. Not because anything external has changed, because the brain that is doing the worrying has been repaired. This is not a metaphor, it is not a comforting fiction, it is what sleep does. And so the final thing we can say, the thing that perhaps sits most gently beside you as you lie here in the dark, is this. The weight of the thought you are carrying does not need to be resolved tonight. It does not need to be figured out or fixed or fully understood before you can sleep. In fact, your understanding of it right now, at this hour, with this depleted and tired but wired brain, is probably the worst understanding of it you will have. The clearest view is on the other side. After the noradrenaline has dropped away and the REM sleep has quietly done its work, and the prefrontal cortex has been restored to its full regulatory function, and the cortisol has climbed gently toward morning, and the light has returned, and the external world has re-engaged the task-positive networks and quieted the inward loop. The clearest view is morning. And morning is coming. It always comes. You do not need to earn it by resolving the thought tonight. You do not need to work hard enough at the worry that it finally yields. The mind's vigilance, the Zeigarnik loop, the amygdala's insistence that this feels urgent, all of that is well-meaning machinery, doing the job it evolved to do in a context it was not quite designed for. In the dark, in the quiet, in a bed where nothing is actually required of you. The machinery is not wrong. It is early. It is doing tomorrow's job tonight, and you can gently, without dismissing it, without fighting it, let it know that tonight's job is already done. You wrote the thing down, or you have decided you will. You named what you are feeling. You breathed slowly, a little more slowly than before, the exhale a little longer than the in-breath. You know now why the thought feels so loud and so certain, and you know that its loudness is not its truth. You know that the brain turning inward in the dark is not a malfunction. It is a brain doing exactly what brains do when the external world goes quiet, and it has been doing it in every human being who has ever lain awake in the dark since long before there were words for any of this. Let us gather for a moment the images we have moved through tonight. We met the default mode network, that constellation of brain regions centered on the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, which Marcus Raichle spent years discovering almost by accident, noticing that certain regions grew quieter when people focused outward and louder when they stopped. We understood that the brain does not switch off when the day ends. It redirects. It turns the spotlight inward, toward the self, toward memory, toward the imagined future. It does this because the quiet is precisely the condition it was waiting for. We met the negativity bias, that deep, ancient tilt in the way the brain processes the world, described by Baumeister and Rosin and their colleagues as bad is stronger than good, not because we are pessimists or broken, but because an organism that treated threats and losses as no more important than pleasures and gains did not survive long enough to pass on its genes. We understood that at night, with the prefrontal cortex softened by tiredness and the amygdala running a little more freely, that bias runs louder. The thought that feels so undeniably true at 2 in the morning is not more true. It is filtering through a system that at this hour is tilted toward the dark, not as a flaw. As a feature that has, for this particular application, unfortunate timing. We met the tired but wired state, that puzzling coexistence of exhaustion and alertness, and we understood it as 2 separate systems. Adenosine building through the waking hours, accumulating its quiet weight, pressing down towards sleep. That is the tired, and the cortisol and adrenaline of a nervous system still humming with the unfinished business of the day, the rumination that fed the HPA axis when it should have been easing, the melatonin signal dimmed by the blue light of a screen held too close in the dark. That is the wired. They can exist at the same time. They do not cancel each other out. But knowing that they are 2 different things means knowing that they can also separately be addressed. We met Bluma Zeigarnik and the waiters she observed in a Berlin restaurant almost a century ago, who could recall every detail of the unpaid table and forgot the settled ones the moment the bill was closed, and we understood why the mind refuses to let go of the unfinished thought. Not out of cruelty, out of diligence. It is performing a monitoring function, holding the open loop open until it trusts that the loop has been handed somewhere safe. And we learned from Masicampo and Baumeister, and from the researchers at Baylor, that what the mind needs is not completion, but a plan. A specific, trusted plan. The notepad, the time, the next step written down. And we moved through the techniques not as a list to follow, but as logical consequences, each one a response to a particular mechanism. The to-do list as the plan maker that closes the Zeigarnik loop. The stimulus control that gently retrains the nervous system to associate the bed with sleep rather than with anxious wakefulness. The paradoxical intention that removes the exhausting effort of trying to sleep and, in the removal, allows it. The cognitive shuffle, the loose, disconnected images that seed the incoherence of healthy sleep onset and dissolve the tight narrative chain of rumination. The affect label that brings the prefrontal cortex back into the circuit, however gently, just by finding a word. The slow breath with the long exhale that speaks directly to the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve that carries the rest signal through the body, lowering the heart rate, easing the muscles, telling the nervous system in its own language that the emergency is over. The body scan, the progressive softening of places held without knowing they were held. And we arrived at the morning, which is not just the absence of the night, but the product of it. The REM sleep that processes the emotional charge without the presence of noradrenaline, that ancient stress chemical, leaving the facts intact, but the weight of them reduced. The restored connection between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the return of the regulatory relationship between the alarm and the one who evaluates the alarm, the cortisol awakening response that primes the body for the day, bringing the capacity to act toward the very things that 6 hours earlier felt impossible. You don't need to have remembered any of it. You don't need to recall the names or the years or the mechanisms or the structures. If there is one thing that has settled somewhere in you tonight, if there is one small shift in how the nighttime mind feels to you now, less personal, less like a failure, more like weather, more like what it actually is, which is a predictable convergence of systems doing their jobs in the dark, then that is the whole of what was needed. The weight you brought to this hour is real. The worry is real. The things that wait on the other side of sleep are real and will be met, but they will be met better, more clearly, with more resource and more proportion, by the brain that has slept than by the one lying awake, rehearsing at midnight. That is not an instruction to stop caring. It is an invitation to trust the night's work, to trust that the quiet hours are not empty, that something is happening in the dark that is in its own way on your side. Breathe in slowly and then out a little longer, and then wait just a moment in the silence at the end of the breath. The thought that is still there, the one that came up again just now, let it be there. You don't have to fight it. You have named it, or you can name it now. A simple word is enough. Worry, sadness, the ache of something unfinished. Let it sit beside you rather than inside you, and then let the breath move again. The room is as it was. The darkness is the same darkness, but something in the quality of it, perhaps, is a little less like a trap and a little more like shelter. The kind of place where repair happens, where the chemistry of the night does its quiet, unhurried work, where the noradrenaline drops and the dreams come, and the emotional weight of the day finds its proper size, where the morning is already, without your effort, being prepared. You are not broken. You never were. You are a mind in a dark room, doing exactly what minds in dark rooms have always done, turning inward, reviewing, feeling the particular weight of the unresolved. And you are also now a mind that knows a little more about why. And knowing why, it turns out, is its own kind of calming. The science is the sedative, the understanding is the rest. The things that wait will still be there in the morning. And so will you, a little clearer, a little more capable of meeting them than you are right now. Let the night do what it does. Let the breath come and go. Let the images grow loose and strange and begin to drift apart in the way that they do when the coherent mind starts to soften at the edges and sleep begins to come. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbor now. Drift off